Most people know him as the king who gave up his throne for love, the handsome prince who chose an American divorcee over a crown and paid with exile. And yet, the truth his own family spent decades burying is far darker than any love story. Behind the fairy tale stood a man who shook the hand of Adolf Hitler, whom a hostile power hoped to crown as its puppet king, and whose war record was judged so dangerous that his own government shipped him across an ocean and sealed the evidence away for a generation. The abdication was the part of the story they were content for you to know. This is the story of the king they had to hide. If you enjoy the stories the history books quietly left out, subscribe now, because what this family buried is far stranger than the fairy tale they let you keep. Chapter 1. The Golden Boy Who Dreaded the Crown. He was the most adored young man in the world, and privately he could not stand the thing he was born to become. On the 23rd of June, 1894, at White Lodge in Richmond Park, a boy was born who would one day be king of the largest empire the earth had ever known. They christened him Edward Albert Christian George Andrew Patrick David. His family called him David. The world, in time, would call him many things, and not all of them kind. He was the eldest son of the man who would become King George V, and the great-grandson of Queen Victoria herself. From the cradle, he was a link in a chain that stretched back 1,000 years. His childhood was gilded, and it was cold. His father was a stern, exacting man who loved his children in the hard fashion of his age, through discipline and correction rather than warmth. A line is often repeated about George V, that he had been frightened of his own father and fully intended his own sons to be frightened of him. Whether or not he ever spoke those exact words, the boy grew up believing them true. His mother, Queen Mary, was dignified and remote, a woman who found it almost impossible to show tenderness to the children she dutifully bore. Edward was slight, fair, and restless. He did not take to the schoolroom, and his tutors despaired of him. He chafed against the endless ceremony that closed around him like a cage. And yet, when he stepped in front of a crowd, something in him came alive. He had a gift few princes are ever given. People looked at him and felt somehow that he belonged to them. On his 16th birthday, he was created Prince of Wales. The next year, in 1911, he was formally invested at Caernarfon Castle, a boy dressed in silk and ermine before a sea of watching faces. He loathed the costume. He performed the part anyway. Already the pattern of his whole life was set. He would give the public the prince it longed for, while quietly resenting the price he paid to do it. Then came the war that broke the old world, and the strange peace that made him famous. The young prince begged to be sent to fight in the trenches like other men of his generation. The army would not risk the heir to the throne at the front, and the refusal shamed him, for the men of his age were dying in their hundreds of thousands while he was kept safe behind the lines. He never quite forgave the war for that. But when the guns fell silent, and a grieving empire looked for something young and living to believe in, it found him. Through the 1920s, the Prince of Wales became the brightest star of the age. He crossed oceans on tours that would exhaust a modern statesman. Consider the sheer scale of it. In a single decade, he journeyed to Canada, to the United States, to Australia, to New Zealand, to India, to the West Indies, and across much of Africa. He sailed tens of thousands of miles aboard the grey warships that carried him. He shook so many thousands of hands that his right hand would sometimes swell and bruise, and he learned to offer his left. He was seen in the flesh by more human beings than any royal figure who had ever lived, across an empire that then ruled close to a quarter of all the people alive on the planet. He was modern in a way his father could never grasp. He wore soft collars where the old king wore stiff ones. He danced through the small hours. He flew in aeroplanes and rode in point-to-point races until his family begged him to stop breaking his bones. He filled the illustrated papers week upon week, the slim blonde prince with the sad eyes and the easy smile. Women adored him. Men wished to be near him. And behind the smile, the restlessness only deepened. He drank more than was wise. He fell into long affairs with married women older than himself, women who mothered him and managed him, for he seemed to need managing above all things. His father watched the drift with mounting dread. George V is said to have made a grim prophecy about his son and heir. "After I am dead," he reportedly warned, "the boy will ruin himself within 12 months." The old king would prove almost exactly right. For the Golden Prince, adored by half the world, carried within him a single, ungovernable flaw. He could not bear to be refused. He had never once in his life been told no and made to accept it. And a man who will not accept no, when he is handed the most powerful position in the land, becomes a danger not only to himself, but to everyone around him. The crown was coming. The only question was what he would do the day it finally reached his head. Chapter 2. The woman a prince could not refuse. She was raised in genteel poverty in Baltimore, twice married and twice bound for divorce, and she would bring down a king. Her name was Bessie Wallis Warfield, and she was born on the 19th of June, 1896, in a modest cottage in the hills of Pennsylvania. Her father died of tuberculosis before she was 6 months old. Her mother was left with almost nothing but a proud name and a hungry child. The Warfields and the Montagues were old Southern families, rich in lineage and thin in the purse. Wallis grew up on the charity of a wealthy uncle, a Baltimore banker named Solomon Davies Warfield, always near money and never once secure in the possession of it. She learned the bitter lessons of the poor relation early. She learned to charm a room before she entered it. She learned to watch, to calculate, to please. She learned that a woman with wit and iron could make herself the single most interesting person present, and that this was a kind of power that cost nothing and could open any door. She was sent, on her uncle's money, to the most expensive girls' school in Maryland, where she rubbed shoulders with heiresses and studied, more closely than any lesson, the manners and the confidence of the rich. She was not beautiful in the conventional way. Her jaw was too heavy, her figure too spare and angular. But she had extraordinary violet eyes, a quick and cutting humour, and a rare gift for making whoever she spoke to feel like the only soul in the world. Men found her magnetic. She fascinated them, and often she frightened them a little too. In 1916, she married a dashing young American naval aviator named Earl Winfield Spencer. The marriage soured fast. He drank heavily, and he flew his aircraft drunk, and behind closed doors he could turn cruel. They parted, reconciled, parted again. In the mid-1920s, while her husband was posted to the Far East, Wallis spent months in China, in Beijing, and in Shanghai. Those months trailed her ever after in a fog of rumour, whispered tales of gambling houses and secret lovers and a pregnancy lost. Almost none of it can be proven. Much of it was invented later by people who wished to see her ruined. Historians have searched for a supposed secret file on her China years and concluded it never truly existed. What is certain is that she came home from the East, harder, worldlier, and finished for good with Win Spencer. They divorced in 1927. By then, she had already found the man who would become her second husband, Ernest Simpson, a courteous half-American shipping man with a deep hunger for respectability. They married in 1928 and settled in London, in a comfortable flat with servants and a foothold, just barely, on the edge of fashionable society. It was from that edge that Wallis Simpson reached out one winter evening and touched the course of history. On the 10th of January 1931, at a country house party, she was introduced to Edward, Prince of Wales. The introduction was made, with terrible irony, by the prince's own reigning mistress, Lady Furness, who could not have dreamed what she was setting in motion. For a time, Wallis was simply one more clever woman in the prince's crowded circle. Then Lady Furness sailed to America and, so the story goes, asked Wallis to look after the prince while she was away. Wallis looked after him rather too well. By the time the mistress returned, she had been quietly and permanently replaced. Something in Wallis held Edward as no woman had ever held him. She did not flatter him. She teased him. She contradicted him. She treated the heir to the throne not as a demigod, but as a slightly spoiled man in need of firm handling, and he found it intoxicating. Here at last was someone unafraid of him, someone who told him the truth and took charge. By the middle of the decade, the transformation in him was plain to the whole court. His own biographer would later reach for a single devastating phrase. The Prince of Wales, he wrote, had become slavishly dependent on Mrs. Simpson. The word slavish was not too strong. He drowned her in money and in jewels of staggering value, ropes of emeralds and diamonds worth a fortune. He rebuilt his days around her moods. He grew sulky and desperate the moment she left his sight. Ernest Simpson, the respectable husband, was quietly eased aside, a spectator at the ruin of his own marriage. Courtiers watched in alarm as the future King of England surrendered his will, piece by piece, to a twice-married American woman who was, in the eyes of the very church he would one day govern, still another living man's wife. His family saw it, and trusted it would burn out as his passions always had before. They did not understand. This was not another affair. This was the one thing on earth he had decided he would never, whatever it cost, give up. Chapter 3. A King for 300 Days. When his father died, the Golden Prince became king, and almost at once the crown began to slip from his hands. On the 20th of January 1936, George V breathed his last at Sandringham. That night, the wireless carried the news to the far corners of the empire. The old king was gone. Long live the new one. Edward was king at last, at the age of 41, sovereign of a quarter of humankind. He took the title King Edward VIII. For a few short months, it seemed the long promise of the Golden Prince might yet be kept. Here was a monarch who spoke the plain language of ordinary men. Later, in that same year, he toured the depressed valleys of South Wales, where the coal pits had fallen silent and whole families went hungry. Standing among the unemployed miners, their faces grey with want, he spoke words that would echo down the century. Something must be done, he told them. Something must be done to find these people work. The newspapers melted with approval. Here, they said, was a king with a heart, a king made for the modern age. But behind the public warmth, the machinery of monarchy was already grinding in alarm. For the new king had made no secret within his own circle of his firm intention. He meant to marry Wallis Simpson, and to make her his queen. And that single fixed purpose set him on a collision course with everything the crown was built to stand for. The trouble was not merely that she was American, though that alone unsettled the old establishment. The trouble was that she was divorced, once already, and soon to be twice, with two former husbands, both still very much alive. The King of England was the supreme governor of the Church of England, and the Church, in 1936, would not bless the remarriage of a divorced person whose former spouse still lived. For Edward to make Wallis his queen was, to the Church, to the Prime Minister, and to the governments of the great dominions across the seas, simply and finally impossible. Consider the height of the position he now occupied, so that the fall to come may be measured against it. He was the crowned head of an empire, spanning close to 500 million souls across every inhabited continent. He commanded a royal navy that ruled the oceans and a web of colonies that circled the globe. His likeness sat on the coins and the postage stamps of dozens of distant lands. His reign had begun only weeks before, and his coronation, the sacred anointing, was already being planned for May of the following year. He held one of the greatest offices the world had ever devised, and he stood ready to throw the whole of it away for a single woman. Through the summer of 1936, he grew steadily more reckless. He took Wallis on a long cruise through the Mediterranean aboard a chartered yacht called the Narlin, and the foreign press, unbound by the deference of the British papers, splashed photographs of the king and his married companion across their front pages. Readers in America and across Europe followed the romance in delighted detail. The British public, kept in the dark by an extraordinary and deliberate silence among their own newspapers, knew almost nothing. The great press barons of the day had agreed among themselves to hold the story back. For months, the most talked about love affair in the world remained a secret from the very people the king ruled. His mother, Queen Mary, was rigid with disapproval. His ministers were frantic. Stanley Baldwin, the Prime Minister, a shrewd and patient pipe-smoking countryman, began the delicate and painful work of trying to save the monarchy from its own sovereign. Again and again, he came to the king and counselled him, give her up, or give up the throne. There was no third path. The church would not bend. The dominions, consulted one by one, would not bend. The constitution itself would not bend. There was, for one brief moment, a scattering of support for the king. A so-called King's Party stirred in the newspapers and in Parliament, and among those who urged caution and delay was Winston Churchill himself, who begged the Commons for more time and was shouted down for his pains. But it came to nothing in the end. The coronation had already been set for the following May, the robes ordered, the rehearsals begun. There would be no coronation now. The crown that had been prepared for one brother's head would settle instead upon the head of another, who had never wanted it and never once been trained to wear it. And Edward would not bend either. Here was the flaw his father had feared, laid bare at last on the greatest stage of all. Told no by his church, his government, and his own family, the king simply refused to accept it, as he had refused all his life. By the autumn, the crisis could no longer be contained. The silence of the British press was cracking at the seams. The country was about to learn what half the world already knew. A king sat on the throne of England beside a woman he had sworn to keep, though keeping her would cost him the crown itself. He had reigned for less than a year. He had not yet been crowned, and the throne was already sliding through his fingers like sand. Chapter 4. The throne he signed away. On a December night in a folly in Windsor Great Park, a king picked up a pen and unmade himself before his own brothers. The house was called Fort Belvedere, and of all the palaces and castles at his command, it was the single place on earth Edward truly loved. He once said of it that he came to love the fort as he loved no other material thing. It had begun as an 18th century ornament, a triangular folly raised in the 1750s to the design of the architect Henry Flitcroft, built for a son of King George II, all mock battlements and a tall central tower looking out across Virginia water. In the 1820s, Sir Geoffrey Wyatville enlarged it for King George IV, adding an 8-sided dining room and a wash of Gothic decoration. Along its northern terrace stood 31 brass cannon, cast 2 centuries before at the Royal Brass Foundry. When the neglected place was granted to him as Prince of Wales in the late 1920s, Edward poured himself into it as he poured himself into nothing else. He drained the old lily pond and sank a swimming pool. He laid tennis courts and built stables. He installed a bathroom beside nearly every bedroom, a steam room, showers, and central heating, comforts that were the height of luxury for the day. He hacked at the overgrown laurel with his own hands, weekend upon weekend, pressing his guests into service beside him. Here, and here alone, the loneliest man in the empire seemed to find a kind of peace. It was fitting, then, that here the empire lost him. Through the first days of December 1936, the crisis broke at last into the open. On the 3rd of December, the British newspapers ended their long silence, and the nation woke to the scandal it had been so carefully spared. There was, for one flickering moment, talk of a middle way, a so-called morganatic marriage, in which Wallis would become the king's wife, but never his queen, and any children of the union barred from the throne. The cabinet weighed it. The Dominion governments weighed it. One by one they answered no. Baldwin put the final choice to the king in plain words. He could keep his throne, or he could keep Wallis Simpson. He could not keep both. And Edward, faced at the last hour with the one word he had spent his whole life refusing to hear, chose the woman. On the 10th of December, 1936, in the drawing room at Fort Belvedere, he signed the instrument of abdication. His 3 younger brothers stood as witnesses to the deed. The next in line, the shy and stammering Duke of York, watched the pen move across the paper and knew that the crushing burden he had never wanted and never been trained to carry was about to fall upon his own shoulders. The following evening, the 11th of December, the man who was no longer king sat before a microphone at Windsor Castle and spoke to the empire he had ruled for 326 days. He told his listeners that he had found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge his duties as king as he would wish to do, without the help and support of the woman he loved. Then he rose, bowed to his brother, the new king, and walked out into the winter night. Before the next dawn, he was aboard a destroyer, crossing the dark channel into an exile that would last the rest of his days. That broadcast became one of the most famous pieces of speech of the century, replayed and quoted for generations after. Yet listen closely to what it did and did not say. It spoke of love and of duty, and of an impossible burden nobly laid down. It said nothing at all of the deeper currents already running in the man, the grievances, the politics, the sympathies that would soon carry him to a mountaintop in Bavaria and a hotel room in Lisbon. The abdication speech was the first draft of the fairy tale, and the nation, weeping by its wireless sets in the winter dark, believed every single word of it. Now weigh what changed hands in those December days, for money is the thread that runs through everything that followed. Here is the reckoning. His reign had lasted 326 days. He was never crowned, yet he did not leave with empty pockets. Sandringham House in Norfolk and Balmoral Castle in Scotland, the private estates the sovereign owns in person rather than through the crown, had passed to him on his accession. As part of the settlement, he sold them to his brother, the new King George VI, for a sum recorded at around £300,000, the equivalent of many millions in the money of today. The king's own private secretary, a hard-eyed courtier named Alan Lascelles, called it a colossal sum, and there was a darker detail woven through the accounting. During those frantic negotiations, Edward gave his family to understand that he was very nearly a poor man, that he would need generous support merely to live in a manner befitting his rank. It was not true. Across his years as Prince of Wales, he had quietly banked a private fortune that contemporaries reckoned at something close to £1 million, drawn from the rich revenues of the Duchy of Cornwall. He pleaded near poverty while sitting upon a fortune. His brother, believing him to be in genuine need, agreed to pay him a substantial tax-free allowance out of the royal purse. When the truth of the Duke's real wealth later came to light, it poisoned what little trust remained between the two brothers. And the allowance became something more than money. It became a leash. For it could be threatened, and it could be withheld, if ever the exiled king misbehaved, or dared to come home uninvited. He believed he had given up a throne for love, and the world would long believe it with him. But the man who sailed into the dark that night had surrendered far more than a crown. Chapter 5. The title that was a punishment. They made him a duke and married him abroad, then denied his wife the 3 letters he wanted most. In the days after the abdication, the new king, George VI, granted his elder brother a new name to live under. He would be His Royal Highness, the Duke of Windsor. It sounded generous. It was, in truth, a carefully measured act of control, and it carried within it a wound designed to last a lifetime. For the title came bound to a cruel condition. Edward would keep the style of Royal Highness, his wife would not. By the letters patent issued in May 1937, the king declared that the Duke should hold that royal style, but that his wife, and any children they might one day have, should never share it. Wallis would be the Duchess of Windsor. She would never be Her Royal Highness. When she entered a room, the women of her husband's own family were not required to bend the knee to her, and pointedly, coldly, did not. To an outsider it might seem a trifle, a quibble over 3 letters and a curtsy. To Edward it was a blade slid between the ribs. He understood in an instant what it truly meant. It meant that his family would never, in all their lives, accept the woman for whom he had given up everything. It meant that in their eyes she was not, and never would be, one of them. He spent years fighting it, writing furious letters, pleading, demanding, at times all but threatening. It never once changed. The denial of those 3 letters would gnaw at him until the day he died, and would poison his every dealing with the family that had cast him out. The wedding took place on the 3rd of June, 1937, at a French chateau near Tours, a house called Grandeur, lent to the couple by a wealthy and worldly businessman named Charles Bedeau, a man whose name would return to haunt them. It was a small and lonely affair. Not one single member of the British royal family attended. The king had forbidden it. No brother stood beside him as he wed. No mother watched her eldest son take his bride. A lone English clergyman defied his own church to perform the service, for the church itself would not sanction it. The most famous bridegroom in the world was married almost in secret, in a borrowed house, in a foreign land, cut off entirely from his own blood. They honeymooned afterwards in a castle in the mountains of Austria, and even there the shadow of the family boycott hung over the couple's happiness. The message from London could not have been plainer if it had been carved in stone. You may keep your woman. You may not keep your family, your country, or your place among them. You are free to love her. You are not free to come home. And so began the long exile that would define all the rest of his life. It was a peculiar kind of banishment, soft and gilded on the surface, iron beneath. He was not imprisoned. He wanted for nothing that money could buy. He drifted between fine houses and fashionable resorts across the continent. Yet he was watched and managed and kept always at arm's length. The king let it be known that his brother was not to set foot in Britain without an express invitation, and that the very allowance on which he partly depended might be cut off should he defy that wish. The threat was seldom spoken aloud. It never needed to be. It hung over every one of the Duke's movements for the rest of his days, like a cloud that would not lift. Something in him hardened in those first years of exile. The charm remained, the immaculate clothes, the practiced warmth, the famous smile. But underneath, a deep and corrosive grievance took root and spread. He had surrendered a throne, and in return for the sacrifice he had received not gratitude nor sympathy, but cold distance and calculated insult. He turned the wound over and over in his mind. He came to believe, with total conviction, that he and Wallis were the wronged ones, martyrs to the small-mindedness of a family that had never understood him and never tried. The couple honeymooned in a castle in the mountains of Austria, and then began the long, restless wandering that would fill the years before the war. They had no country of their own now, and no fixed place in any. They moved between rented villas on the Riviera and grand hotels in the great cities of Europe, a king without a kingdom, and a duchess the palaces would not bow to. Everywhere they were received as celebrities and curiosities. Nowhere were they received as family. And slowly, warmed by the flattery of strangers, the Duke began to seek the respect he craved in places his own country would very soon come to dread. The man who had lent them his chateau for the wedding, Charles Bedeau, would come to a dark end of his own. His tangled web of business dealings reached deep into Nazi Germany, and in time he would be arrested by the Allies on suspicion of trading with the enemy, and would take his own life before he could ever be brought to trial. It was precisely the kind of company the Duke now kept, worldly, restless, and drawn like iron filings toward the rising power in Berlin. The circle around the exiled king was filling, year upon year, with exactly the sort of men his country would very soon have every reason to fear. A man in that condition is a dangerous thing to leave loose in the world. Bitter, idle, immensely rich, and cut adrift from every duty that had once anchored his restless nature, the Duke of Windsor wandered through Europe in the late 1930s in search of someone, anyone, who would treat him as the great man he still believed himself to be. He would not have to search for long, for across the Rhine a regime was rising that understood, better than his own family ever had, exactly how to flatter a discarded king. And it had already begun to take a close and careful interest in him. Chapter 6. The King Who Admired the Dictator. Barely a year off the throne, he stood in a mountain retreat above Berchtesgaden and shook the hand of Adolf Hitler. It was the 22nd of October, 1937. The place was the Berghof, the dictator's alpine hideaway high in the Bavarian mountains, and the visitor climbing the steps to meet him was the former King of England, not 11 months removed from the throne of the very nation that Germany would soon set out to destroy. The tour had been arranged by that same worldly businessman, Charles Bedeau, who had lent the couple his chateau for their wedding. On its surface, the purpose was innocent enough. The Duke, they announced, wished to study housing and working conditions for the ordinary German labourer, a subject that fitted neatly with his old image as the prince who cared for the common man. The couple crossed into Germany on the 12th of October and spent close to a fortnight being feted by the Third Reich as visiting royalty. Their principal host was Robert Ley, the coarse and hard-drinking head of the German Labour Front. They were paraded through model factories and clean new workers' housing. They dined with the men who ran the Nazi state. The Duke met Hermann Göring and Joseph Goebbels. The Duchess took tea with Rudolf Hess, the deputy to Hitler himself. Everywhere the couple went, the full machinery of Nazi hospitality rolled out to receive them. And everywhere they went, they were met with the stiff raised arm of the Nazi salute. The record here is careful, and it is damning. The Duke and Duchess were repeatedly greeted with that salute, and, in the plain words of the account, they sometimes returned it. Photographs were taken. Those photographs travelled the world. A former British king, raising his arm in the gesture of Hitler's Germany, less than a year after wearing the crown of the nation that would soon stand alone against that regime. The meeting at the Berghof was the summit of the whole tour. For about an hour, the Duke and the dictator spoke in private, with only an interpreter in the room. What passed between them has never been fully known, for the official minutes of the conversation were lost, most likely destroyed in the chaos of the war. The interpreter, a professional named Paul Schmidt, later insisted that the Duke had said nothing truly political, offering only some warm words about Germany's schemes of social welfare. But the Duke's own equerry, a young man named Dudley Forward, who accompanied the couple throughout, remembered something colder and more troubling. He recalled his master telling Hitler that the German and the British peoples were one race and ought never again to be turned against each other. Whatever the precise words, the meaning of the images was beyond mistaking. Hitler was delighted with his guest. He gave the couple an affectionate farewell, it is said, taking both their hands in his. He came away convinced that the Duke was a friend to Germany, and he remarked that in Wallis, the Duke had found a woman who would have made a good queen. The Nazi leadership filed the whole visit away as intelligence of the highest value. Here was a discarded king who admired them, who nursed a bitter grudge against the establishment that had cast him out, and who might, one day, prove very useful indeed. The crowds that greeted the couple in the German towns were large and warm, carefully arranged by a regime that understood the propaganda value of every cheering face. The Duke, who had spent his whole life reading crowds, seemed to bask in the welcome that his own country no longer offered him. He inspected the marching ranks of Labour Front workers. He toured the model housing estates built to show off the new Germany at its shining best. He met Heinrich Himmler and the other architects of the regime, and he spoke with them not as a wary foreign guest, but as a sympathetic and interested friend. To the men of the Reich, every hour of the visit confirmed their fondest hope. Here was a man who plainly liked what he saw, and who wished with all his heart that Britain and Germany might be friends. In Britain, the reaction was horror, thinly veiled by protocol. The government forbade its diplomats to take any official part in the tour. Newspapers called it, with careful understatement, an affair in poor taste. A planned second leg, a tour of the United States, collapsed entirely when American labor unions rose in fury at the thought of the couple being paraded across their country as friends of a regime that had crushed its own workers into silence. The American visit was quietly abandoned in embarrassment. To understand the Duke in these years, one must set his politics beside those of many in the British upper class of the 1930s. Fear of communism ran very deep in the great houses. Admiration for the order and discipline of the dictatorships was common in the drawing rooms of the aristocracy. A powerful current of feeling held that another war with Germany would be a catastrophe to be avoided at almost any cost, and that Britain would be wiser to seek an accommodation than a fight. The Duke shared these views, and he held them more fiercely than most. He believed a war with Germany would be madness and ruin. He believed the two nations were natural partners, kept apart only by folly. And, most dangerous of all, he believed with total conviction that had he only remained upon the throne, he alone could have prevented the whole coming tragedy. That last belief is the key to the danger he now posed, for it meant that a former king, embittered against his family, sympathetic to the enemy, and certain of his own thwarted greatness, was loose in Europe on the very eve of the greatest war in history. He thought himself a man of peace and reconciliation. Others, in Berlin, looked at the same man and saw a tool they might one day pick up and use. And when the war he so dreaded finally came, the question of exactly whose side the Duke of Windsor was truly on would cease to be a matter of drawing-room gossip. It would become, for a few desperate months, a matter of his country's survival. Chapter 7. The soldier they could not trust. Given a uniform and sent to France, he was soon suspected of letting his country's secrets slip toward the enemy. When war broke out in September 1939, the Duke of Windsor came home to England for a brief and painfully awkward visit, then was handed a role designed to keep him occupied and, his family devoutly hoped, out of harm's way. He was made a Major General attached to the British military mission with the French army. His task was to tour the French defences and to report back on what he found. It seemed a harmless enough posting for a restless former king. It was anything but. For the Duke, in his new uniform, was now granted access to some of the most sensitive information in the Allied world, the plans and the dispositions of the armies standing against Germany. And within a few short months, a terrible suspicion began to gather itself around him. Through the winter of 1939 and into the early months of 1940, the so-called phony war, the Duke toured the French lines and wrote up detailed reports on what he saw. Some of what he observed, and some of what he set down on paper, concerned the very weaknesses in the Allied defences, including the wooded and lightly held stretch of front through which the Germans would in fact launch their war-winning blow that coming spring. Then, in February 1940, came the allegation that has shadowed his name ever since. It was whispered, in circles with access to intelligence, that details of Allied defensive plans had somehow found their way into German hands, and that the leak might have passed through the Duke, or through the wide and careless social circle that surrounded the couple, a circle that included more than one figure of openly pro-German sympathy. Let the record be honest at this point. The allegation of leaking was never proven in any court. It was never established beyond reasonable doubt. It remains an allegation, grave and much debated, but an allegation still, and it should be weighed as one. What is not in the least doubtful, however, is the pattern of behaviour that surrounded it. The Duke was indiscreet to a reckless degree. He was openly defeatist. He spoke, to people who ought never to have heard such words from a former king, of his firm conviction that Britain could not win the war, that the whole struggle was folly, and that peace with Germany must be made at once. In a nation bracing itself for invasion, a member of the royal family talking down his own country's chances was far more than an embarrassment. It was a genuine danger to morale and to the war itself. Churchill, watching from London, grew steadily more uneasy about his old friend. Telegrams passed back and forth about what was to be done with the Duke, where he might safely be placed, how he might be kept from doing harm. The former king was proving impossible to manage. He quarrelled over questions of precedence and over money. He complained bitterly that his wife was never given her due. He seemed, to the harried men trying to run a war, to understand nothing of the danger the country now stood in, and to care for little beyond his own wounded pride and his own comfort. Beneath the petty grievances lay the far graver worry. A man so bitter, so defeatist, and so openly sympathetic to the enemy was a liability wherever he happened to stand. In the reports he wrote from the French lines, and in the loose talk he scattered so freely among his circle, there was always the risk that something of real value might slip toward Berlin, whether he meant it to or not. The war was only a few months old, and already the Duke of Windsor had become a problem his own side did not know how to solve. Then, in May and June of 1940, the world the Duke had known came crashing down. The German armies smashed through the French defences, at precisely the point of weakness the Allies had most feared. In a matter of weeks, France, which fielded what many believed was the finest army in Europe, collapsed into rout and surrender. The Duke and Duchess, who had been living in the south, joined the vast and desperate tide of refugees streaming away from the advancing enemy. They fled first towards the Riviera, then across the frontier into Spain, and onward at last to neutral Portugal and the city of Lisbon. And here, the Duke did a thing that, to many, remains the very hardest of all his acts to forgive. As the couple abandoned their homes to the coming Germans, he made a request through intermediaries. He asked that the German authorities take special care to protect his houses in Paris and on the Riviera from any harm or looting. A former king of the nation that Germany was at that very moment striving to bomb into submission was asking the enemy to stand guard over his furniture. Whatever his true intentions, the request told Berlin something vital about the man. The Duke, they saw, was thinking about his comfort and his possessions, not about the war his country was fighting for its very life. He was a man, they concluded with cold satisfaction, who could be reached. By the high summer of 1940, the situation had become truly extraordinary. Britain now stood entirely alone. The Battle of Britain was about to open in the skies above the fields of Kent. And in a hotel in neutral Lisbon, there sat a former British king, embittered against his own family, defeatist about the war, sympathetic to the enemy, and surrounded by people of the most doubtful loyalty. In London, the new Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, grasped the peril at once and completely. The Duke could not be left where he was. He was too exposed, too disaffected, too dangerously useful to the wrong people. And in Berlin, the men around Hitler had reached the very same conclusion from the opposite direction. They too saw a former king sitting wounded and willing and within reach, and they had already begun to draw up a plan for him. The point of no return had come. Chapter 8. The Plot to Crown Him Again. In the summer of 1940, the most powerful men in Germany hatched a scheme to turn a former king into a puppet. They gave the plan a code name. They called it Operation Willi. And for a few taut and dangerous weeks in July of that year, the fate of the Duke of Windsor, and with it perhaps a small sliver of the fate of the war, hung in the balance in the neutral cities of Spain and Portugal. The scheme came from the very summit of the Nazi state. The German foreign minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop, a vain and grasping man who had once served as Hitler's ambassador in London, took personal charge of it. To carry it out on the ground, he chose a rising star of the SS intelligence service, a clever and utterly ruthless young officer named Walter Schellenberg. Their aim was simple to state and staggering to contemplate. They meant to get the Duke of Windsor into German hands. The reasoning behind it was cold and shrewd. Here was a man who had worn the British crown, who was known to be bitter at his family, who admired Germany and privately doubted his country could win. If he could be persuaded, or if it came to it coerced, into placing himself under German protection, the propaganda value alone would be immense beyond reckoning. And there was a darker possibility whispered through the captured records that would surface only after the war. Should Germany win the war and conquer Britain, the Duke might be lifted back onto the throne, this time as a puppet king, ruling a defeated nation on Berlin's behalf, a familiar face to reconcile a broken people to their new masters. The Germans understood that money would speak loudly to a man of the Duke's tastes and grievances, and so a sum was set aside for his maintenance that reveals just how seriously Berlin took the whole enterprise. 50 million Swiss francs were earmarked to keep the Duke in the style he expected, should he only come over to them. Set that vast figure beside the picture of the exiled king, who had pleaded near poverty to his own brother a mere 4 years before. And the temptation Berlin was dangling swims into sharp focus. The enemy stood ready to pay a fortune for a former king. His own family had paid to keep him quiet and far away. Everyone, it seemed, from London to Berlin, had come to the same understanding. The Duke of Windsor had a price. Schellenberg set to work with the practiced tools of his sinister trade. He could not simply seize the Duke on neutral soil without risking a diplomatic catastrophe. So instead, he set about making Lisbon feel dangerous and Spain feel safe. His agents threw stones at the windows of the villa where the couple were staying in the dark of night. They spread rumours that the British Secret Service meant the Duke harm, that he would be quietly killed or locked away the very moment he left neutral ground. Bouquets of flowers arrived bearing veiled warnings. The couple's luggage was tampered with to delay their departure. Sympathetic Spanish grandees were sent to whisper in the Duke's ear, among them a member of the powerful Primo de Rivera family, inviting him to Spain for hunting and quiet talks, painting Britain as a trap and Spain as a haven of safety and honour. There was a further, stranger thread woven through the plot. The Duchess had left clothes and belongings behind in their Paris home, now under German occupation, and a scheme was floated to allow a trusted servant to travel through the German lines to fetch them. To the men in Berlin, every such small errand was a thread to be pulled, another point of quiet contact, another little dependence that might in time be turned into leverage over the couple. Nothing about the pair was ever too trivial for the plotters to note down and to use. Day upon day through that hot July, the telegrams flew between Lisbon, Madrid, and Berlin. Schellenberg reported minutely on the Duke's shifting moods, his hesitations, his grievances, his fears. The Germans believed they were making real progress. They believed the fruit was slowly ripening on the branch. All they needed, they told themselves, was a little more time, a little more pressure, a little more flattery, and the former King of England might yet walk of his own free will into their waiting arms. And every single day he lingered in Lisbon, weighing his grievances against his duty. The peril to Britain grew a shade heavier, and the captured German telegrams recorded something that ought to trouble anyone inclined to see the couple as wholly innocent bystanders. When it was suggested to them that the course of the war might yet transform the constitutional situation, that the throne itself might one day come within reach again, the Duchess is recorded as growing thoughtful at the words. The Germans came away believing the Duke could be worked upon, that with enough pressure and enough flattery, he might in time be brought across. Whether they judged rightly, no one can now say with any certainty, for the plot never reached its final test. For in London, Winston Churchill had seen the danger with total and unforgiving clarity, and he moved to end it. The Duke could not be permitted to remain in Europe, within the enemy's grasp, a hair's breadth from disaster. Churchill needed to put a wide ocean between the former king and Berlin, and he needed a reason for it that would not look like the exile it truly was. He found one. He sent the trusted lawyer Walter Monckton out to Portugal to stiffen the Duke and hurry him along, and when the Duke hesitated and haggled over terms even then, Churchill let it be known that a serving officer who refused his posting might face the sternest military consequences. On the 1st of August, 1940, the couple at last boarded a ship and sailed from Lisbon, out of the reach of the men who had schemed to make a puppet of a king. The plot had failed, but the strange exile it forced upon him was only now beginning. Chapter 9. Banished to a third-class colony. To keep him out of the enemy's reach, they made him governor of islands he privately dismissed as beneath him. The post that Churchill devised for the Duke of Windsor was governor of the Bahamas, a scattered chain of low, sunlit islands in the western Atlantic, about as far from the battlefields of Europe as the Crown could possibly contrive to send a man. It was a genuine office with genuine duties. It was also, and every soul involved understood this perfectly, a gilded cage dressed up as an honour. The Duke knew it too, and he resented it bitterly. In private, he was scathing about his new domain. He called the Bahamas a third-class British colony and made little effort to conceal his sense that a former King of England had been grievously insulted by being packed off to govern a handful of tropical islands. The couple arrived in the capital, Nassau, in the sweltering heat of August 1940, and the Duke settled to the business of ruling with a mixture of dutiful effort and open, weary distaste. He would hold the post for close to 5 years, until his resignation in March 1945. The first scandal came quickly, and it came, as so often with this couple, over money and appearances. Government House, the official residence of the governor, was found by the Duchess to be shabby, cramped, and quite unfit for people of their standing. And so, in the very middle of a world war, while Britain herself was being bombed night after night and rationing bit hard into every household at home, the residence was closed and expensively refurbished to the Duchess's exacting taste. The contrast was lost on no one. In London, families were sleeping on the platforms of underground stations as the bombs rained down. In Nassau, the former king's wife was choosing fabrics and remaking a mansion to her liking. It was precisely the kind of tone-deaf extravagance that would come to define the couple's entire war. Then there was the troubling matter of the company the Duke chose to keep. Among his closest friends on the islands was a fabulously wealthy Swedish industrialist named Axel Wenner-Gren, a man whose vast fortune, whose Bahamian bank, and whose tangled dealings across borders had drawn the deep and hostile suspicion of both British and American intelligence. They regarded him as a probable friend of the Axis powers, and in time his name was placed on an official blacklist. That the king's own brother, the governor of a British colony in the very midst of the war, should be intimate with such a man was, to London and to Washington alike, both a scandal and a serious worry. Wherever the Duke went, it seemed, he drifted by instinct towards exactly those people his country's spy masters most distrusted. The islands themselves were no idle paradise beneath the Duke's rule. In the summer of 1942, labourers working on a great airfield project rose up in anger over the meagre wages they were paid, and rioting broke out in the streets of Nassau. The unrest was serious, with looting and violence and lives lost before order was restored. The Duke's handling of it revealed the man. He was quick to call for troops to put the disorder down, yet he also grasped, more clearly than some of the island's white elite, that the grievances beneath the riot were real, and he pressed, in his way, for the wages to be raised. It was, perhaps, his most creditable hour as governor, and it was quickly forgotten in the shadow of what came next. Wenner-Gren's great white yacht, one of the largest private vessels of its kind then afloat, had carried the couple on cruises through the islands, and its comings and goings were watched closely by intelligence men who suspected it of far darker business than pleasure. When the war reached across the Atlantic and the Swede was blacklisted at last, the Duke's friendship with him became a quiet embarrassment that London much preferred to forget. But it was of a piece with everything else. Wherever there was money without a clear source, or a man under a heavy cloud of suspicion, the Duke of Windsor seemed always to be found somewhere close at hand. The daily round of the governorship wore upon him. The heat was relentless, and the society of the islands small and quarrelsome. The Duchess loathed the place and made little effort to hide her contempt for it. The couple escaped when they could to the mainland, to Florida, and to New York, drawing yet more criticism for their travels and their spending while the world was at war. He did his duty, after a fashion. He opened buildings and reviewed troops and signed his papers. But his heart was never once in it, and everyone on the islands could see as much. He was a king in name only, marking time in a place he despised, waiting for a war to end so that he might return to the life of idle grandeur he still believed was his by right. The islands were his prison, and he knew it well, and he served out his sentence with the sullen patience of a man convinced he had been deeply and unjustly wronged. Consider the sheer strangeness of the Duke's war, set against the war his countrymen were fighting and dying in. From 1940 to 1945, while many millions fought and bled across Europe, across Asia, and upon every ocean, the former King of England spent the whole of the conflict on a peaceful colonial island thousands of miles from any front line. He presided over garden parties and petty local disputes, while London burned and armies were ground to powder. He had once been the sovereign of a quarter of the world. Now he cut ribbons in Nassau and privately counted down the days until his sentence in paradise was served. Yet even paradise could not keep scandal from his door. For all its sunshine and its ceremony, the colony harboured dark currents of jealousy and fortune and secret dealing. And in the summer of 1943, those currents would throw up a crime so shocking and draw from the governor a response so strange that it would stain his name for the rest of his life and long past it. Chapter 10. The Murder, a Governor Buried. When the richest man on the islands was found bludgeoned and burned in his bed, the governor took strange charge of the case. His name was Sir Harry Oakes, and he was one of the wealthiest men in the whole of the British Empire. Born in the American state of Maine, he had made a colossal fortune in the goldfields of Canada, then moved to the Bahamas for the gentle climate and the gentler taxes. King George VI had made him a baronet in 1939. He was a hard, rough-spoken, self-made man, and on the islands he was a power in his own right, with his fingers in land and business across the colony. On the morning of the 8th of July, 1943, after a night of tropical storm, Sir Harry Oakes was found dead in his bed in his Nassau mansion. He had been discovered by a business friend named Harold Christie, who had stayed the night in the house. The manner of the death was horrifying beyond words. Oakes had been struck 4 times about the head with some sharp and heavy instrument. His body had then been doused with an inflammable liquid and set alight, and feathers from a torn pillow had been scattered across the burned and battered corpse. It was a savage, almost ritual killing of one of the Empire's richest men, and it ought to have brought the full weight of the finest detectives in the world down upon the islands. What happened instead has never ceased to raise hard questions. The Duke of Windsor, as governor, took personal charge of the investigation from its very first hours, and almost every decision he then made seemed calculated to muddy the waters rather than to clear them. His first act was to attempt a total news blackout, to keep word of the murder out of the newspapers altogether. It failed within hours, for a local paper broke the story to the world before the censorship could take hold. His second decision was stranger still, and it has never been satisfactorily explained. Rather than call in Scotland Yard, the natural and obvious course for a murder of such magnitude in a British colony, the Duke reached across the water to Miami and summoned 2 American police detectives, men named Edward Melchin and James Barker, whom he happened to know from his own visits to Florida. These 2 men, with no jurisdiction whatever and no proper business in a British murder inquiry, effectively seized control of the entire investigation. And they moved with a speed that struck many as deeply suspicious. Within about 36 hours, they had arrested a suspect. It was Oakes's own son-in-law, a raffish and worldly French Mauritian named Alfred de Marigny, who had married the dead man's daughter Nancy against her father's furious objection. The trial that followed was a sensation across the world, and it fell to pieces in the most damning fashion imaginable. The central plank of the case against de Marigny was a single fingerprint, said by the detectives to have been lifted from a Chinese screen in the murder room, placing the accused man at the scene of the killing. But under close examination in the courtroom, the fingerprint evidence simply collapsed. It emerged that the print had almost certainly not come from the screen at all, but had been lifted from a glass or some other smooth object that de Marigny had touched during his own questioning, and then presented to the court as though it came from the scene of the crime. The jury saw straight through it. Alfred de Marigny was acquitted, and, being a foreigner, was swiftly ordered to leave the colony. And there the matter ended, and there it has stubbornly remained. No other soul was ever charged with the killing. The murder of Sir Harry Oakes has never been solved to this day. It stands as one of the great unsolved crimes of the century, a locked house mystery wrapped in island heat and imperial money. Theories have swirled ever since, of business rivals and organized crime and dark dealings in wartime finance and casino gambling, but nothing has ever been proven, and likely nothing ever will be. The theories multiplied in the years that followed, each one darker than the last. Some pointed the finger at Harold Christie, the friend who had found the body and whose account of that stormy night never quite held together under scrutiny. Some pointed further afield, at organized crime and the men who wanted to bring gambling and glittering casinos to the islands, and who may have clashed with a stubborn old millionaire standing in their way. Some whispered of wartime money moved in secret through the Bahamas and out again, of hidden fortunes that needed to stay hidden, and of a rich man who had come to know a great deal too much. None of it was ever proven. All of it swirled endlessly around the strange, silent center of the case, the governor who had tried so very hard to keep the whole thing out of the light. A crime was committed in his colony, and the first instinct of the king's own brother had been to draw a curtain across it. What lingers over the whole affair, decades on, is the conduct of the governor. Why did the Duke of Windsor first try to smother the story rather than solve the crime? Why did he pass over Scotland Yard for two detectives from Miami who had no standing in the case? What, if anything, was he trying to keep from coming to light? Perhaps it was nothing more sinister than vanity and poor judgment, a weak man out of his depth who reached for the nearest familiar faces. Perhaps it was something more, some thread that led back into the tangled web of wartime money and blacklisted friends that surrounded him on the islands. The honest answer is that no one truly knows. But the episode showed the world, in miniature, exactly the kind of ruler he had always been. Faced with a crisis, the former king reached first not for the truth, but for a way to keep it buried. It was a habit, as the whole world would very shortly discover, that ran deep in his family. Chapter 11. The Papers Hidden in a German Castle. As the Reich collapsed, American soldiers stumbled on the documents that told the half of his story he had prayed would stay buried. The war in Europe was ending. In the spring of 1945, as the Third Reich crumbled beneath the advancing Allied armies, the victors began to seize the archives of the shattered German state. And among the mountains of captured paper lay a secret that would trouble the British Crown for a generation to come. The scale of the haul was staggering to behold. As American forces pushed deep into central Germany, they uncovered a vast trove of German Foreign Ministry records that the Nazis had tried first to hide and, in places, to burn. Hundreds of tons of documents were recovered, discovered in a castle and its grounds in the hills of central Germany. a young American officer, was among the first to grasp what had been found. The material was gathered together, sorted, and much of it eventually brought to a castle at Marburg in the German region of Hesse. It is from that place that the most sensitive files took the name by which history would come to know them. They were called the Marburg Files. Buried within that ocean of paper was a smaller, far more dangerous cache, sometimes called simply the Windsor file. It held the German record of their dealings with the Duke of Windsor. It held the telegrams of Operation Willi, the reports of the approaches made to him in Lisbon, the cold assessments of his sympathies and his usefulness, the schemes to lure him over, and in the event of a German victory, perhaps to lift him back onto a puppet throne. Here, set down in the enemy's own hand, was the paper trail of the plot to turn a former British king into a tool of the Reich. Now weigh what those documents truly represented, for the arithmetic of it is remarkable. The captured German archive ran to hundreds of tons of material, a weight of paper it would take a fleet of lorries to shift. Within that mass, the file that touched directly upon the Duke amounted to only a modest bundle, perhaps 60 documents, a few dozen telegrams and reports at most. Yet those few dozen pages carried a charge out of all proportion to their number. They recorded contacts between a member of the British royal family and the deadliest enemy the nation had ever faced. At the very moment, Britain stood alone and fighting for her life. A handful of pages, lost within an archive the weight of a battleship, and every single one of them a potential scandal that could shake the monarchy to its foundations. The story of the archive's survival is itself a small drama of the war's end. As the Reich collapsed into ruin, German officials had loaded the most sensitive foreign ministry records onto lorries and tried to spirit them away, to be burned or buried before the enemy could seize them. They very nearly succeeded. But the advancing Americans caught the convoy and its precious cargo, and among the officers sorting through the mountain of paper, one grasped the extraordinary value of what had fallen into Allied hands. Instead of ashes, the deepest secrets of the German state passed intact and whole to the victors. Among all the treaties and dispatches and intercepted cables, the file on the Duke was a slender thing, easy to overlook and impossible to forget once it had been read. It set out, in the enemy's own precise and bureaucratic prose, exactly how Berlin had come to view the former King of England. Not as a neutral figure to be respected and left alone, but as an asset to be cultivated and, in time, harvested. A man of known grievances and known sympathies. A man who might, in the right circumstances, be persuaded or bought or frightened into serving the very power his country was fighting to the death to defeat. To read those few pages was to see the fairy tale from the outside, through the cold, appraising eyes of the enemy, and the view from that angle was very ugly indeed. For the men who now held those papers in their hands, the discovery posed an agonizing question. The war against Germany was won, but here, in black and white, was evidence that the king's own brother had been, at the very least, a figure the enemy sincerely believed they could turn to their purpose. What on earth was to be done with it? The truth, laid plainly before the public, would be devastating, and not to the Duke alone. It would strike at the whole institution of the crown, and at the worst possible moment, just as that crown was being celebrated the world over as the very symbol of British courage, endurance, and defiance in the darkest hour. There was, too, a wider pattern to the seizing of such papers at the war's end, for the German records were not the only sensitive correspondence the British establishment worked to gather up and control in those chaotic final months. Where the reputation of the crown was concerned, nothing was left to chance, and quiet hands moved to secure whatever might one day prove embarrassing. The Windsor file was the most dangerous prize of all. and everyone who understood its contents understood at once that it could never be allowed to surface unguarded. The Duke, for his part, understood exactly the danger the papers posed to him. So did his family. So did the government. And the instinct that had governed the murder inquiry in Nassau, the deep reflex to bury rather than to reveal, was about to be exercised once again. But this time, it would be exercised at the very highest level of the British state, and upon a matter not of one island crime, but of history itself. The war had produced its evidence at last. Now the only question that remained was whether the world would ever be permitted to see it. And the answer, for a very long time indeed, would be a firm and deliberate no. The man who had reigned 326 days now faced the exposure of everything he had done in the years since. That he escaped that exposure for so long is the final, and perhaps the most revealing act of the entire story. Chapter 12. The cover-up a king demanded. When they learned what the captured files contained, the answer was not the truth, but a lock and a long silence. The discovery of the Windsor file confronted the British establishment with a stark choice between honesty and self-protection, and it did not agonize over the decision for very long. From the highest offices in the land, the word came down. The papers were to be suppressed. The world was not to know. The moving spirit of the cover-up reached to the very summit of British life. Winston Churchill, who had done more than any single man to save the country, and who felt a long personal loyalty to the Duke stretching all the way back to the Abdication crisis, threw his weight behind suppression. He consulted the king, and King George VI, the shy younger brother who had been handed the crown his sibling threw away, was adamant on the point. The files that touched his brother must be kept from the public eye. They must not be released. The reputation of the monarchy, so lately the rallying point of a nation at war, could not be permitted to bear so terrible a stain, and so the papers were locked away in the dark. For years, the captured German archives sat under British and American guard, while officials wrangled behind closed doors over what could ever be safely published. The most sensitive material was held firmly back. Diplomatic pressure was applied, again and again and again, to keep the Windsor documents out of any official published record of the German papers. The historians appointed to edit the captured archive, working jointly under British, American, and French authority, pressed hard for the full truth to be published, as scholars will. They were resisted at every turn by a British government determined to protect the crown. What had happened in Lisbon in the summer of 1940 was to remain a secret, kept not by the beaten enemy, but by the king's own victorious government. The captured papers were held for years at a country house in Buckinghamshire, guarded and quietly sorted far from any public view. The historians charged with editing the German archive were serious and independent scholars, and they chafed at the very idea of publishing a version of history with its single most sensitive chapter neatly torn out. The American and French authorities who shared control of the papers were a great deal less anxious than the British to protect the reputation of a foreign royal family, and they pressed steadily for openness. It took years of quiet diplomatic struggle, of pressure and counter-pressure between wartime allies, to settle at last how much of the truth the world would ever be allowed to read. Trace the long timeline of the silence, for it reveals just how fixed and determined the concealment truly was. The papers were captured in 1945, yet only a small portion of the sensitive material crept into the light in 1954, nearly a decade after the war had ended. And it was not until 1957, a full 12 years after the documents were first seized, that the main body of the material was at last forced into publication in the official series of captured German diplomatic papers, and even then only over sustained and stubborn British resistance. Nor was the release complete even then. Further files touching upon the affair were not open to public view until as late as 1996, more than half a century after the guns fell silent. For over 50 years, across the reigns of two monarchs, the machinery of the British state laboured to keep the full truth of one man's war out of the histories. Think carefully on what that means. A nation that had fought a long and terrible war in the very name of freedom and truth spent half a century concealing the wartime record of a former king. The enemy who had schemed with him was crushed and gone to dust. The danger of invasion was decades past, and still the papers stayed shut, because the thing being guarded was never national security at all. It was reputation. It was the polished image of the crown. It was, in the end, the fairy tale itself. Here is the very heart of the whole matter, the truth this long account was built to uncover. The instinct that governed the affair from first to last was not justice, but concealment. When a member of the royal family became a grave liability, the reflex of the institution was not to expose and to confront, but to hide, to lock away, to smother beneath silence. The same monarchy that could spin a discarded king's abdication into the century's great romance could also make his wartime record simply vanish for 2 full generations. The abdication, remember this, was the part of the story they were content for you to know. The rest they buried, first in a castle, then in a vault, and then in a silence that held fast for 50 long years. Chapter 13. The beautiful, useless exile. For 30 years he was the most glamorous unemployed man in Europe, rich, idle, and never once allowed to come home for good. When the Duke of Windsor gave up his Bahamas post in March 1945 and the war ended in Europe soon after, he came back not to Britain but to France. And there, in comfortable and gilded exile, he lived out the long remaining chapter of his life. It would last another 27 years. It would be, by any ordinary reckoning, a life of enormous privilege. And it would be, at its very core, an empty one. The setting for that emptiness was magnificent. The city of Paris granted the couple the use of a grand mansion on the edge of the Bois de Boulogne, a fine house they held for a merely nominal rent, with the French government graciously exempting the Duke from paying any income tax at all. There they kept a small and formal court, staffed and stiff with protocol, where the Duke insisted, to the very end of his days, that his household treat the Duchess with the royal honours his own family had so pointedly denied her. Servants were required to address her as Your Royal Highness within those walls, whatever the world outside might say. In 1952, the couple bought a country retreat as well, an old mill outside Paris called the Moulin de la Tuilerie, the one and only property they would ever truly own between them. They dressed exquisitely. They dined out. They kept small dogs and famous friends. They were photographed at parties and openings, the celebrated couple who had given up a throne, aging slowly, in the warm amber of their own legend. But glamour is not purpose, and the Duke had no purpose left to him. He had no work, no duty, no role in the world. He had once been the busiest prince of his age, and now he had nothing whatever to do but fill the long and hollow hours. He wrote his memoirs, published in 1951, a book that sold very well and that carefully burnished the particular version of events he wished the world to keep believing. He and the Duchess drifted between Paris and the fashionable resorts of Europe and America. And, to the quiet fury of London, he supplemented his income in ways that shamed the family that already despised his choices, dabbling in the illegal movement of money across borders in defiance of the strict currency controls of the age, using his position and his contacts to shield and grow his wealth. The old habits of self-interest never once left him. Through all of it, the coldness from his family never truly thawed. His mother, Queen Mary, went to her grave in 1953 without ever once receiving the Duchess, without ever meeting the woman her eldest son had given up a crown to marry. The bitterness on both sides ran deep, and it ran long. The Duke had written to his mother, before the war, that one of her letters had destroyed the last vestige of feeling he had left for her, and that wound never healed on either side. He was permitted to come home only for the great family funerals, a guest hovering at the very edge of the ceremonies of the institution he had once led. He stood among them at the funeral of his brother, King George VI, in 1952, the brother who had taken up the burden he laid down, and who had insisted to the last that his secrets stay buried. He came again for the funeral of Princess Marina in 1968. At those grey and formal gatherings, he was a ghost from another age, tolerated, watched, and never once truly welcomed back among his own. At the very end, there came a small and human softening, offered almost too late to matter. In the spring of 1972, the Duke lay dying of cancer of the throat in his Paris house, frail and shrunken and old. And that May, Queen Elizabeth II, his niece, came to see him. She was on a state visit to France, and she called at the house in the Bois de Boulogne to sit for a few quiet minutes with the failing old man who had once, so briefly, been her king. It was a gesture of reconciliation extended at the very last. He died only days afterward, on the 28th of May, 1972, at the age of 77. Only in death was he fully allowed to come home. His body was brought back to England, and he lay in state at Windsor, where tens of thousands of ordinary people filed slowly past the coffin of the king who had left them. He was buried on the 5th of June, 1972, in the Royal Burial Ground at Frogmore, in the green shadow of the castle where he had signed away his throne 36 years before. And when the Duchess herself died in 1986, broken at the last by age and dementia, she was laid to rest beside him, brought inside the family enclosure from which, in all her living years, she had been so firmly shut out. In the end, the family took them both back, but only once they could no longer say a single word. Chapter 14. What the fairy tale was hiding. The world was handed a love story, and a love story was exactly what the family needed it to keep believing. For the better part of a century now, the tale has been told the same way, over and over, until it has hardened into something like truth. The handsome king who loved so deeply and so purely that he gave up an entire empire for the woman he could not live without. The greatest royal romance of the modern age. It is a beautiful story. It is also, as this long account has tried to show, a curtain, carefully cut and carefully hung, drawn across something the family could not afford the world ever to see. Return for a moment to where all of this began, to the Golden Prince, adored by the crowds of a quarter of the world, to the slim young man with the sad eyes who could make a perfect stranger feel that he somehow belonged to them. That prince was entirely real. The adoration was real. But so too was the other man who lived inside the very same skin, the one who could not bear to be told no, who nursed his grievances patiently into something poisonous, who shook the dictator's hand and asked the enemy to guard his houses, whom Berlin marked down in cold ink as a king they might one day crown again. Both of those men were the Duke of Windsor. The fairy tale kept only the first of them, and quietly, expertly, buried the second. Weigh the two halves of the ledger one final time, and let the numbers do the work. On the one side lies the romance the world was so generously given. On the other lies the record the world was so carefully denied. He reigned 326 days and was never once crowned. He sold Sandringham and Balmoral to his own brother for around £300,000, while pleading that he was very nearly poor, sitting all the while upon a private fortune of close to 1 million. He met Adolf Hitler in October 1937 and returned the Nazi salute. A hostile power set aside 50 million Swiss francs to keep him as its puppet, and the papers that proved the plot were locked away from 1945 until, in their final portion, 1996. More than 50 years of silence to protect a single crown. The romance took a paragraph to tell. The truth took half a century to bury. So what, in the end, does this story truly reveal? It reveals something about monarchy itself that all the pageantry is designed to keep hidden. That an institution built upon image will, when one of its own becomes a danger, reach first not for justice, but for concealment. That the same power which can turn an abdication into a legend can just as easily turn a wartime betrayal into a blank space in the archives, a gap where a chapter should be. The abdication was the part of the story they were content for you to know. Everything else they hid, and they hid it with great skill, because hiding is a craft that old families and old crowns have had 1,000 years to learn and to perfect. Both stories were true. That is the hardest thing of all to hold in the mind at once. He did love her, and he did give up a throne to keep her. And he was also a man his own country came to see as a danger it had no choice but to hide. The fairy tale was not exactly a lie. It was a single truth, chosen with great care and set down deliberately in the place where another truth should have stood. And there is a quiet warning folded into it, for anyone who loves a royal romance or thrills to a grand old name. The stories handed down about the powerful are very rarely the whole of the story. They are the version that was allowed to survive, the version that was permitted, the version laid down with enormous care over the top of whatever could not be allowed to see the light of day. Grandeur, in the end, is not only the palaces and the jewels and the beautiful people frozen in the old sepia photographs. Grandeur is also the quiet machinery that decides what will be remembered and what will be erased. The Duke of Windsor gave up a throne, and the world was handed a love story. What the world was not handed, his own family sealed inside a German castle, and then inside a British vault, and then inside a silence that outlived almost every soul who might have been wounded by the truth. He came to love the fort, he once said, as he loved no other material thing. He signed away his crown in its quiet panelled rooms, and he was buried at the last within sight of it. And above his grave the fairy tale still stands, lovely and complete, exactly as it was built to stand. But now, perhaps, you can see the true shape of the thing it was built to cover, and that is the whole difference between the story they gave you and the story that was real. If you want more of the history the fairy tales leave out, subscribe and stay with the channel. And tell me this in the comments. Do you think the Duke of Windsor was a traitor who meant it, or a weak man used by cleverer people? And where are you watching from tonight?